US equities have been soaring to new record highs. But what about stocks south of the border in Mexico? Well, with the recent launch of futures on the S&P BMV IPC index in Mexico, it's a good time to ask, are Mexican stocks a bargain compared to their US counterparts? Well, if you look at the price to earnings ratio, the S&P is trading at 25 times this year's estimated earnings, whereas Mexican stocks are trading at roughly half of that, at only 13 times this year's estimated earnings. Now that said, Mexican interest rates are also twice as high as those in the US, meaning that the discount factor applied to Mexican earnings is also much higher, meaning that it's sort of ambiguous as to which market is a better value on a price-earnings basis. But there's a lot more to know beyond valuation levels about Mexican equities. First of all, if you look back to the year 2000, Mexican equities have had a relatively strong performance. If you look at it in local currency terms, the S&P BMV IPC index has delivered roughly twice the return of the Russell, the NASDAQ, and the S&P. However, the problem is local currency. So the Mexican currency has fallen by 50% so far this century versus the dollar. What that means is if you look at them from the same currency perspective, viewing them both in USD, in that case, Mexico's stock market has returned almost exactly the same amount since the year 2000 as the three big US indices. But what's interesting is Mexico's stock market did those returns largely at different times. For the first 12 years of the century, between 2000 and 2012, Mexican stocks were the big outperformer. Since 2012, the US stocks have been the major outperformer. So what's interesting here is that it seems like Mexican equities and US stocks deliver different returns at different times, which means the Mexican equity market could be a potentially good portfolio diversifier. And indeed, if you look at the industry groupings in the Mexican stock market, they're very different than in the US. The Mexican stock market is dominated by consumer staples, materials, industrial, and financial stocks, whereas over 1/3 of the value of the S&P 500 comes from technology stocks. So that can explain that low correlation. So overall, investors in the US stock market might look at Mexico's stock market as a potential portfolio diversifier.